My name is Melody, and at 30 years old, I found myself sitting in a suffocating family courtroom, watching my life be systematically destroyed. I am a landscape architect, a woman who spends her days meticulously designing environments that bring people peace and order, yet my own world had been turned into a barren, chaotic wasteland. Across the aisle sat my ex-husband Damian, a 32-year-old hedge fund manager who wore his custom-tailored suit like an impenetrable suit of armor. His high-priced legal team had spent the last 2 grueling hours painting me as an unstable, unfit mother. They ruthlessly twisted my late nights at the design firm and the heavy emotional toll of our past fertility struggles into a fabricated, damning narrative of complete mental collapse. The judge, a stern man with absolutely no patience for family drama, adjusted his glasses and raised his heavy wooden gavel. He was ready to issue the final ruling, ready to award full and exclusive custody of our 6-year-old son Leo to the man who had actively orchestrated my ruin. I squeezed my eyes shut tightly, bracing for the sharp strike of the wood that would legally sever me from my child forever. But the sound never came. Instead, a small, innocent voice echoed clearly through the high-ceilinged room. "Mr. Judge, who will the little sister in the freezer live with?" The entire courtroom instantly fell pin-drop silent. I opened my eyes and looked directly at my sweet boy. Leo was standing near the witness box, clutching his favorite plush dinosaur, staring up at the towering wooden bench with wide, curious eyes. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin, almost impossible to breathe. I turned to look at Damian. The smug, victorious grin had vanished completely from his face, replaced rapidly by an ashen, sickly pallor. He looked as though all the blood had been drained from his body in a single instant. A loud, sharp clatter broke the heavy silence. In the spectator gallery, Monica, Damian's 28-year-old mistress, had dropped her designer purse in sheer panic. The contents spilled messily across the polished hardwood floor, but she did not move a single muscle to pick them up. Her hands were trembling visibly, her eyes darting frantically toward Damian for guidance. The judge slowly lowered his gavel, his brow furrowing in deep, unsettled confusion. He leaned over the massive bench and gently asked Leo to repeat his question. My son, completely unaware of the explosive device he had just detonated in the middle of a legal proceeding, repeated his words loudly and clearly. I felt a profound, violent shock ripple through my entire physical body. A sickening puzzle piece suddenly snapped into sharp focus within my mind, connecting fragmented clues I had previously failed to understand. The judge immediately halted the proceedings, declaring an emergency recess to address the child's shocking statement privately in chambers. But my mind was already spiraling rapidly backward, racing frantically to the exact moment this waking nightmare truly began. It all started exactly 6 months earlier, on the night of our 7th wedding anniversary. I had left my design studio early that afternoon, picking up premium steaks and an expensive bottle of red wine, eager to celebrate a milestone with the man I thought was my partner in everything. We had built a beautiful life together, survived the grueling 4-year journey of in vitro fertilization that finally resulted in Leo and I genuinely believed we were stronger for having weathered those storms. When I pulled into the paved driveway of our upscale suburban home, I noticed all the interior lights were off. Assuming Damian was planning a romantic surprise, I unlocked the front door quietly and walked inside. There were no candles burning, no soft music playing, just the stark, harsh reality of an impending betrayal. I found Damian in our master bedroom, moving methodically and silently in the dark, tossing his expensive clothes into a large leather suitcase. He did not even bother to look up when I flipped on the overhead light. I dropped the grocery bags on the floor, asking him what was going on, begging to know if there was some sudden family emergency. He zipped the suitcase shut forcefully, grabbed his leather briefcase, and walked right past me down the main staircase. I followed him closely into the kitchen, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. He stopped abruptly at the central kitchen island, pulled a thick stack of stapled papers from his briefcase, and tossed them carelessly onto the cold marble countertop. They were formal divorce filings. The absolute coldness in his eyes was something I had never seen before in our decade together. He looked at me, not as a devoted wife, but as a failing investment he was finally liquidating. He stated flatly that he was entirely done with our marriage. He said he was exhausted from living with a broken woman, a woman whose body had failed time and time again to perform naturally. He explicitly and cruelly threw my painful fertility struggles directly in my face, calling me mentally exhausted, defective, and emotionally draining. He twisted the torturous years of hormone injections, the devastating miscarriages before we had Leo, and the subsequent failed implantations into a sharp weapon against me. He claimed my desire to expand our family had turned me into someone he could no longer stand to be in the same room with. The sheer cruelty of his calculated words paralyzed me where I stood. We had stored 2 viable female embryos at a private fertility clinic, a beacon of future hope we had mutually agreed to preserve. Now he was standing in our kitchen, brutally reducing my agonizing medical journey to a repulsive character flaw. I tried to reason with him, begging him to stop packing and talk to me, pleading with him to consider our young son sleeping peacefully upstairs. Damian simply smirked, adjusting his expensive silk tie, and told me he had already taken care of all the necessary arrangements. He grabbed his heavy suitcase and walked confidently out the front door, leaving me standing completely alone in the deafening silence of our empty home. Pure panic set in almost immediately as the reality of his departure washed over me. I reached for my phone with shaking hands and opened our joint banking application, desperately needing to ensure I had enough funds to hire a competent lawyer the very next morning to protect my rights and my child. The loading screen vanished, and a wave of pure, unadulterated terror washed over me. The available balance read 0. I refreshed the mobile application repeatedly, praying it was merely a digital glitch or a temporary network error. It remained steadfastly at 0. I ran frantically to my purse and pulled out my personal credit cards, logging into the respective financial accounts one by one on my mobile web browser. Every single card had been permanently canceled by the primary account holder. In the span of a single hour, while I was driving home, happily planning an anniversary dinner, my husband had completely and ruthlessly stranded me financially. He had deliberately locked me out of our joint savings, drained our shared checking accounts dry, and severed my personal lines of credit without warning or explanation. I was left standing in a dark kitchen in the middle of the night with absolutely no access to liquid money, no way to pay for a safe hotel room, and no financial ammunition to fight the devastating legal war he had just declared against me. He had executed a perfect cold-blooded ambush, ensuring I would be entirely helpless and destitute when the sun came up, forcing me into a battle for my son and my stolen future. That absolute disadvantage did not materialize overnight. The architecture of Damian's cruelty had been meticulously constructed right in front of me, laid bare during the previous Thanksgiving dinner at his mother's sprawling estate. Looking back from the cold reality of my empty kitchen, I realized the warning signs had been flashing brilliantly in neon all along. I had simply chosen to close my eyes to them, desperate to maintain the fragile illusion of our happy family. Beatrice, my 58-year-old mother-in-law, was the undisputed matriarch of a highly curated, deeply superficial world. Her annual Thanksgiving dinners were less about family gratitude and entirely about displaying her extreme wealth and asserting her dominance over everyone in her orbit. Her dining room was a cavernous space designed to intimidate, featuring a massive mahogany table set with heavy sterling silver antique crystal goblets and towering floral centerpieces that made eye contact across the table nearly impossible. I had always felt like an intruder in her home, a middle-class landscape architect who had somehow infiltrated their pristine bloodline. Beatrice never missed an opportunity to remind me of that exact fact. The holiday gathering had started with the usual suffocating tension. The guest list was padded with Beatrice's country club friends and Damian's wealthy business associates. I sat rigidly in my high-backed velvet chair, wearing a carefully chosen silk dress, doing my absolute best to play the role of the grateful, supportive wife. Damian sat directly across from me, already on his third glass of expensive vintage Bordeaux. He engaged in animated conversations about offshore investments and luxury vehicles, with the men flanking him acting as though I did not exist. I spent the first hour of the meal silently cutting my food, managing Leo's plate, and absorbing the subtle, passive-aggressive remarks Beatrice directed my way regarding my career and my background. Then came the dessert course, and with it Beatrice's favorite theatrical tradition. Every year she presented a select few guests with what she called tokens of appreciation, small, heavily wrapped gifts meant to symbolize her deep connection to her family. When the uniformed catering staff cleared our dinner plates, Beatrice stood at the head of the table. She tapped a silver spoon against her crystal water glass, demanding absolute silence from the room. She handed out a few generic presents, silk scarves and expensive cigars, before her sharp, calculating gaze landed squarely on me. She signaled to a server who placed a beautifully wrapped rectangular package directly in front of my place setting. The paper was thick, textured gold tied with a flawless satin ribbon. The entire table turned their collective attention toward me, their faces glowing with polite, wealthy curiosity. Beatrice offered a saccharine, entirely fabricated smile. She announced loudly to the crowded room that she had found something incredibly special for me, something she believed would finally bring peace to my troubled heart. My hands began to shake slightly as I pulled at the satin ribbon. I tore the gold paper away, revealing the hard cover of a thick book. I stared down at the title and the remaining air was violently punched out of my lungs. It was a comprehensive, heavily illustrated guide on adopting orphaned children. The subtitle boldly highlighted alternative pathways for women whose biological bodies had failed them. A thick, horrifying wave of humiliation washed over me, burning my cheeks and stinging the back of my eyes. This was not a gift. It was a public execution. Beatrice knew every single agonizing detail of our fertility journey. She knew about the 4 relentless years of daily hormone injections that had left my abdomen bruised and swollen. She knew about the agonizing miscarriages, the nights I had spent curled on the bathroom floor sobbing until I vomited. She knew exactly how much physical and psychological trauma I had endured just to bring Leo into the world. More importantly, she knew about the recent devastating failures we had experienced trying to implant our remaining female embryos. She took my deepest, most private medical trauma and weaponized it as a cruel parlor trick in front of 24 strangers. Beatrice continued her monologue, her voice echoing off the high vaulted ceilings. She stated that it was a tragedy when a woman simply could not perform her most basic biological duty, but that modern society offered wonderful charitable alternatives for those who knew when to stop forcing nature. She looked at me with an expression of pure, concentrated malice disguised as maternal concern. She was publicly declaring me a barren, defective vessel, unworthy of carrying the family legacy. I desperately sought my husband's eyes across the massive table. I looked at Damian silently, begging him to intervene to defend his wife, to protect the mother of his child from this grotesque psychological abuse. I needed him to stand up, to take the book, and to walk us out of that toxic house. Damian did absolutely nothing. He looked directly at me, his expression entirely blank. He did not frown. He did not reprimand his mother. He simply swirled the dark red wine in his crystal goblet, took a slow, deliberate sip, and turned his head to ask the man next to him about a recent golf tournament. He abandoned me completely in a room full of predators. His silence was not just passive complicity. It was an active, deliberate choice to let me bleed out emotionally for his mother's entertainment. The profound isolation I felt in that exact moment was absolute. I was entirely alone, trapped in a gilded cage, surrounded by people who viewed my agony as casual dinner conversation. The urge to break down, to scream, to flip the heavy mahogany table and storm out into the freezing November night was overwhelming. I could feel the tears threatening to spill over my lower lashes, hot and demanding. But I refused to give Beatrice the satisfaction of watching me shatter. I dug my fingernails so deeply into my own thighs under the table that they left crescent-shaped bruises I would carry for weeks. I forced my spine completely straight. I looked directly into Beatrice's cold, triumphant eyes and offered a tight, emotionless smile. I thanked her politely for the reading material, my voice steady, betraying none of the absolute devastation ripping through my chest. I set the book aside, picked up my fork, and forced myself to take a bite of pie, chewing mechanically, as the dinner party resumed its superficial chatter around me. I swallowed my grief to maintain the peace, unaware that this horrific dinner was merely the opening act of the nightmare they had planned for my life. The deafening silence following Beatrice's cruel presentation stretched across the massive dining room. I stared blindly at the adoption book in front of me, my hands clammy and my heart pounding violently. I was fully prepared to endure the rest of the evening in numb compliance, retreating into the familiar survival mechanism I had utilized for years. But I had forgotten that I did not come to this dinner alone. Sitting 3 chairs down from me was my sister-in-law, Nia. My brother Miles had married Nia 5 years ago, and she was an absolute force of nature. A striking African-American woman with a brilliant razor-sharp mind, she worked as a high-powered financial investigative lawyer. She dealt with ruthless corporate fraud and white-collar criminals daily. Beatrice's petty, elitist, suburban cruelty was entirely out of its depth against her. Nia slowly placed her linen napkin on the polished table. The movement was so calm and deliberate that it drew the eyes of every single guest in the room. She looked directly at Beatrice, her expression radiating absolute terrifying authority. Beatrice, Nia said, her voice carrying a chillingly polite tone that commanded total silence. What a fascinating choice of literature. Tell me, did you pick this up in the self-help aisle, or is passive aggression just a natural talent you have been cultivating all your life? The entire table froze. Damian finally stopped swirling his expensive wine, his head snapping toward Nia, in genuine shock. Beatrice sputtered, her carefully powdered cheeks flushing an ugly mottled shade of crimson. She attempted to maintain her aristocratic facade, stammering that she was merely offering supportive maternal guidance and that women needed to accept their biological realities. Nia did not miss a single beat. If we are discussing realities, let us discuss basic human decency. Melody has shown nothing but extraordinary grace while navigating a profound medical journey. You, on the other hand, just used a holiday dinner to perform a grotesque display of psychological abuse disguised as a gift. It is genuinely embarrassing to witness a grown woman behave with such profound insecurity in her own home. Nobody moved. Nobody even dared to breathe. Beatrice sat with her mouth slightly ajar, entirely stripped of her social power in front of her country club friends. Damian finally found his voice, slamming his hand on the table and demanding that Nia apologize to his mother immediately. My brother Miles stood up without a second of hesitation. He placed a firm, warning hand on Damian's shoulder, his voice dangerously low as he told Damian to sit back down and mind his tone. The tension in the room was explosive. Nia simply offered Beatrice a tight, victorious smile, picked up her wine glass, and took a slow, elegant sip. She had single-handedly dismantled the matriarch's reign of terror and effectively ended the dinner party. Guests began making hasty, awkward excuses to leave. The opulent dining room emptied rapidly as the atmosphere turned unbearably toxic. I felt a confusing, overwhelming mixture of profound gratitude and lingering shock. I desperately needed a moment to breathe, to splash cold water on my burning face and collect myself. I slipped away from the chaotic foyer and retreated to the guest powder room at the far end of the hallway. I locked the heavy wooden door behind me, leaned heavily over the marble sink, and stared at my exhausted reflection. A soft, urgent knock broke my concentration. It was Nia. I unlocked the door, letting her inside. She immediately relocked it behind her and turned on the brass faucet to muffle our voices. The protective, fierce sister-in-law who had just defended me at the dinner table was gone. In her place stood the calculating, highly trained financial investigator, Her dark eyes were deadly serious, entirely devoid of the triumphant spark she had shown in the dining room. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. I nodded, thanking her for stepping in, when my own husband did absolutely nothing. Nia shook her head, reaching into the pocket of her tailored blazer. "Melody, listen to me very carefully. While we were in the coat room getting ready to leave, Damian's cashmere overcoat fell off the hanger. When I picked it up, a piece of paper slipped out of the inner breast pocket. I would normally never look, but my gut has been telling me something is incredibly wrong with him lately." She pulled out a crumpled, neatly folded slip of thermal receipt paper and handed it to me. My fingers trembled as I took it. I flattened the creases against the cold marble countertop. It was a credit card receipt, but not from a high-end restaurant or a luxury car dealership. The merchant name, printed boldly at the top, was a private, highly exclusive fertility clinic located downtown. It was the exact same medical facility where Damian and I had spent years trying to conceive, the very place where our remaining viable embryos were currently frozen in storage. I stared at the total amount charged to the card. It was a massive, staggering payment of exactly $15,000. The transaction had been processed just 2 days prior. My heart hammered violently against my ribs, a cold sweat breaking out across my skin. I looked closely at the billing details. The card used was one I had never seen before, ending in 4 unfamiliar digits. It was clearly a hidden account Damian had opened in secret. But the most horrifying detail was not the massive amount of money or the secret credit card. It was the patient name printed clearly under the transaction identification number. The payment was not authorized under my name. It was processed under the name Monica Reeves, an entirely unknown woman. I felt the marble floor swaying beneath my feet. My husband had just sat in absolute silence while his mother publicly mocked my infertility. Yet secretly, he had just paid $15,000 to our fertility clinic for a woman I did not know. The walls of the small powder room closed in on me. The realization was physically sickening. Damian was not just a coward who failed to protect his wife. He was actively financing a massive secret medical procedure with another woman at the exact facility holding the keys to my biological future. I folded that damning piece of thermal paper and slid it deep into the lining of my purse. The drive home from Beatrice's estate that Thanksgiving night was the longest, most agonizing journey of my entire life. Damian sat in the driver's seat of his luxury sedan, his hands resting casually on the leather steering wheel, completely oblivious to the fact that I was now holding the blueprint of his deception. I stared out the passenger window at the passing streetlights, forcing my breathing to remain slow and even. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to pull the receipt out, to throw it in his face, and to demand an immediate explanation for the $15,000 charge. But my sister-in-law Nia had trained me well in those few minutes we shared in the powder room. Confronting a highly manipulative, financially powerful man without irrefutable proof is just giving him the opportunity to destroy the evidence and rewrite the narrative. I needed to see exactly what he was buying before I showed my hand. For the next 2 weeks, I played the role of the devoted, oblivious wife flawlessly. I packed his lunches, ironed his custom dress shirts, and kissed his cheek when he walked out the door. It was physically sickening. Behind his back, I was operating with the cold, calculated precision of the landscape architect that I am. I map out complex terrain for a living. I know exactly how to survey a site, identify structural weaknesses, and uncover hidden faults buried deep beneath the surface. My own marriage had just become my most critical, high-stakes project. I monitored his schedule quietly, noting the subtle changes in his routine, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The opportunity finally arrived on a bitter, overcast Tuesday morning in early December. Damian stood in our kitchen, adjusting his silk tie in the reflection of the microwave oven, and casually announced he had an early breakfast meeting downtown with a prospective hedge fund investor. He said he would be entirely unreachable until noon. The slight shift in his gaze, a micro-expression of deception I had finally learned to recognize, told me everything I needed to know. I smiled warmly, wished him luck, and waited for the heavy garage door to close. As soon as his vehicle cleared the end of our street, I grabbed my keys. I had anticipated this exact scenario. Knowing my own recognizable SUV would stand out instantly, I had borrowed an inconspicuous gray sedan from one of my junior design assistants, under the guise of needing it for a rough construction site visit. I pulled out of the driveway, keeping a careful, strategic distance behind Damian's sleek black car as we navigated the morning suburban commute toward the city limits. Trailing your own husband through busy city streets is an agonizing, surreal experience. My knuckles were stark white against the steering wheel. The morning traffic was dense, a chaotic sea of red brake lights and honking horns, forcing me to stay hyper-focused so I would not lose him at a busy intersection. The physical toll of the anxiety was immense. My stomach churned, and a cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck. My mind raced with 1,000 horrifying scenarios, wondering if I was about to follow him to a luxury hotel, a secret apartment, or a hidden jewelry store. I braced myself to find him meeting a glamorous colleague or a wealthy socialite. Instead, 45 minutes later, he bypassed the towering skyscrapers of the financial district entirely. He signaled right, turning down a quiet, tree-lined avenue in the city's upscale medical district. My breath caught sharply in my throat as I instantly recognized the route. My hands began to tremble so violently that the steering wheel shook. I pulled the borrowed sedan into a parking space half a block away and killed the engine, my heart hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against my ribs. Damian parked his vehicle along the curb in front of a sleek, modern glass building. I stared at the clinical minimalist facade, feeling a violent wave of nausea crash over me. I knew this building intimately. I knew the exact layout of the sterile waiting room, the specific calming shade of blue painted on the exam room walls, and the heavy definitive sound the security doors made when they locked. It was the private fertility clinic, the exact same high-end medical facility where we had spent years trying to conceive Leo, and where our 2 remaining viable female embryos were currently frozen in cryogenic storage. I slouched down slightly in the driver's seat, pulling out my smartphone and zooming the camera lens to get a clearer view through the chilly morning air. Damian stood on the sidewalk, leaning casually against his car, checking his luxury watch. He was not going inside for a meeting. He was waiting for someone. 3 agonizing minutes passed before the heavy glass doors of the clinic slid open. A woman walked out into the crisp morning air. She was young, vibrant, and dressed in form-fitting designer scrubs, with a warm winter coat draped casually over her shoulders. Damian immediately pushed off his car. He did not greet her with a professional handshake or a polite, distant nod. He wrapped his arms tightly around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest, and buried his face in her neck. The embrace was deeply intimate, aggressively possessive, and dripping with an easy, established familiarity that made my stomach violently churn. I zoomed the camera lens in further, desperate to see the face of the woman who was dismantling my family. As she pulled back from the embrace to smile brightly up at my husband, her features came into sharp, undeniable focus on my glowing screen. The phone nearly slipped from my sweating fingers. I knew her. I knew her incredibly well. The woman wrapped happily in my husband's arms was Monica. But she was not just some random, unknown woman named Monica Reeves from a hidden credit card statement. She was Nurse Monica. She was the bright, overly reassuring head nurse of the fertility clinic. She was the woman who had personally drawn my blood countless times, held my hand, while I cried uncontrollably over negative pregnancy tests, and prepped my body for the excruciating egg retrieval surgeries. She was the highly trusted medical professional who had intimately guided Damian and me through the absolute most vulnerable, traumatic physical experiences of my entire life. A horrifying, suffocating realization paralyzed me in the front seat of that cold car. Memories flooded back the way Monica used to smile a little too warmly at Damian during our consultations, the way he knew her schedule perfectly, passing it off as simple logistical planning. This was not a standard cliché corporate affair. Damian was not just sleeping with another woman. He was sleeping with the gatekeeper of my biological material. He had secretly funneled $15,000 to the head nurse of the exact facility that currently held the keys to my unborn children. The sheer scale of the betrayal mutated instantly from a simple marital infidelity into a massive, terrifying violation of my medical and familial sanctity. My husband was actively colluding with the woman entrusted with my most sensitive, highly protected medical files. As I watched them kiss passionately on the sidewalk, completely unbothered by the world around them, I realized with absolute chilling certainty that they were not just stealing my marriage. They were plotting to steal my future. The horrifying realization of Damian and Monica's collusion paralyzed me only for a fleeting moment. The primal, fiercely protective instinct of a mother snapped me back to harsh reality. I threw the borrowed sedan into drive and sped away from the fertility clinic. I needed a ruthless family law attorney immediately. I needed a legal shark who could tear through Damian's pristine corporate facade. But retaining high-caliber legal counsel in this city required a massive upfront cash retainer, and Damian had already frozen my credit lines and zeroed out our joint mobile banking applications. I refused to believe the money was simply gone. It defied all logic. I drove straight to the main branch of our primary financial institution, determined to sit across a heavy oak desk from a human being and demand concrete answers about my own life savings. I marched into the polished marble lobby of the bank and demanded an urgent meeting with the branch manager. Sitting in a cold glass-walled office, I watched the manager type furiously on his computer keyboard. His expression shifted rapidly from professional courtesy to deep, uncomfortable pity. He turned his flat-screen monitor toward me and explained the sheer devastating scale of my husband's financial ambush. Damian had not just moved our money overnight in a sudden fit of marital rage. As a seasoned hedge fund manager, he had spent the entire past year systematically bleeding our marital assets dry. He had set up a complex labyrinthine web of offshore accounts and completely untraceable corporate shell companies. Every single holiday bonus, every major investment return, and a massive portion of my own landscape architecture earnings had been quietly, methodically siphoned away into financial black holes. On paper, our marriage was entirely bankrupt. I possessed absolutely nothing. I left the bank feeling as though the solid concrete pavement had vanished beneath my feet. Damian had planned this vicious divorce for 12 long months. He had spent a full year smiling warmly at me across the dining room table, sleeping peacefully in my bed, and playing the devoted, loving father to Leo, all while meticulously building a financial guillotine meant for my neck. I sped back to our suburban estate, my mind racing with desperate, fragmented strategies. I needed to gather my personal identification documents, Leo's passports, and whatever physical valuables I could quickly pawn or sell to fund my legal defense. I prayed I would have a few quiet hours to strategize before he returned from the city. I pulled into our wide driveway and slammed my foot on the brake so hard the tires screeched. Two local police cruisers were parked awkwardly across the front lawn, their lights flashing bright red and blue against the manicured evergreen hedges I had personally designed and planted. Damian stood casually on the front porch, flanked by two armed uniformed officers. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs as I threw my car door open and ran up the stone walkway. I demanded to know what was happening and why law enforcement was standing on our doorstep. Damian did not even blink. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick stack of heavily stamped legal documents, handing them smoothly to the closest officer. The officer looked at me with a mixture of stern authority and mild sympathy. He explained firmly that I was currently trespassing on private corporate property. I stared at the officer in absolute staggering disbelief. I raised my voice, insisting that this was my marital home, the house I had painstakingly renovated, decorated, and lived in for years. Damian smirked a cold, empty smile and pointed a manicured finger to the paperwork in the officer's hand. He explained in a clinical, detached tone that he had quietly transferred the deed of the house 6 months ago. It now legally belonged to a newly formed real estate holding corporation. And the sole exclusive proprietor of that specific corporation was his mother, Beatrice. I was completely and utterly blindsided. Beatrice had effectively purchased the ground right out from under my feet without me ever signing a single piece of paper. Damian informed the police officers that I was an unstable, estranged guest who was no longer welcome on the premises. Because my name was nowhere on the newly minted corporate deed, the officers stated they had no legal choice but to enforce the immediate eviction. They gave me exactly 10 minutes to pack my belongings and vacate the premises. 10 minutes to distill an entire decade of marriage, motherhood, and irreplaceable memories into what I could carry with my own two hands. I rushed frantically up the main staircase, the two officers shadowing my every single move as if I were a violent, unpredictable criminal. My hands shook so violently I could barely zip the single canvas suitcase they allowed me to take. I grabbed a few rapid changes of clothes, my architectural drafting tablet, and the framed photograph of Leo holding his green plush dinosaur from my bedside nightstand. I begged the officers for just a little more time to pack my son's favorite toys and warm clothes, but Damian yelled forcefully from the bottom of the staircase that Leo's belongings were staying exactly where they were. The police escorted me back down the stairs and out the heavy front door. I stood on the cold concrete walkway, shivering in the brisk air, clutching my one meager suitcase. Damian stepped off the porch and walked slowly toward me, stopping just inches from my face. He leaned in close, ensuring the police officers standing nearby could not hear his toxic, venomous whisper. He told me to enjoy living on the streets. He laid out his final brutal threat with terrifying clarity. He said he was filing an emergency custody order first thing in the morning. He planned to march straight into family court and inform the presiding judge that I was completely destitute, mentally unstable, and entirely homeless. He was going to use the exact financial ruin and sudden homelessness he had actively engineered to legally strip me of my child forever. I dragged my single canvas suitcase down the long, winding driveway of the estate I had painstakingly designed, feeling the icy sting of the winter wind biting directly through my thin coat. The heavy wooden front door had closed behind me, trapping my entire life, my memories, and my sleeping child inside a fortress that now belonged to a corporate entity controlled by my malicious mother-in-law. I climbed back into the borrowed gray sedan, my hands shaking so violently I could barely fit the key into the ignition. I drove to a cheap, decaying roadside motel on the industrial outskirts of the city, using the few crumpled dollar bills I found buried at the bottom of my purse to secure a room for the night. I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, staring blankly at the peeling wallpaper, fully realizing the terrifying magnitude of Damian's perfectly executed ambush. However, Damian and Beatrice were not simply satisfied with seizing my financial assets and stripping me of my marital home. They needed to ensure that no one in our affluent community would offer me a lifeline. They wanted to completely obliterate my personal reputation so that when Damian formally filed for emergency custody, the entire social hierarchy would eagerly support his fabricated claims. By the time the sun rose the next morning, their ruthless, calculated social assassination was already operating at maximum efficiency. My phone began buzzing relentlessly with automated notifications, indicating I had been permanently removed from the school parent-teacher association group chats, the neighborhood watchboards, and the local country club mailing lists. When I attempted to call the women I had considered my close friends and confidants for nearly a decade, my calls were routed instantly to voicemail. Those who did answer spoke in hushed, incredibly brief tones, making poor excuses to hang up before blocking my number entirely. I soon discovered the toxic narrative Beatrice had gleefully seeded across her elite social circles. She had spent the entire morning making hushed theatrical phone calls to the most influential women in our community, spreading a vicious, highly detailed rumor that I had suffered a catastrophic mental breakdown. She claimed I had developed a severe hidden addiction to prescription pills following my fertility treatments and had voluntarily abandoned my husband and child in the middle of the night during a manic episode. The story was a masterpiece of character assassination, blending just enough truth about my agonizing medical history with absolute horrifying fiction to make it entirely believable to the suburban elite. Desperate to see Leo and assure him I had not abandoned him, I drove straight to his prestigious private elementary school during the afternoon pickup rush. The moment I stepped through the heavy glass doors of the administrative office, the warm, welcoming smiles the staff usually reserved for me vanished instantly. The school principal immediately pulled me into a private conference room, her expression a harsh mixture of pity and deep, unsettled suspicion. She informed me that Damian had filed expedited emergency court documents that very morning. He had officially notified the school board of my supposed severe substance abuse crisis and instructed them legally to deny me any access to the campus or my son to protect the child's physical safety. I was escorted off the educational property by a campus security guard. As I walked the long path back to my borrowed car, I had to pass the long line of luxury SUVs waiting for pickup. I saw the judgmental, horrified whispers of the other mother's women who had eaten dinner at my table just weeks prior as they quickly rolled up their tinted windows and locked their car doors when I walked past. I had been successfully painted as a dangerous, unstable addict fully exiled from my own life. I sat in the cold parking lot of a nearby grocery store completely broken. I had absolutely no money, no home, and my son had been snatched away behind an impenetrable wall of carefully constructed lies. The crushing weight of total defeat threatened to shatter my sanity completely. I rested my forehead against the steering wheel and finally allowed the tears to fall, sobbing until I could barely breathe. Just as the darkness threatened to consume me entirely, my phone rang. It was my older brother, Miles. Within 20 minutes, Miles and his wife, Nia, pulled aggressively into the grocery store parking lot in their sleek SUV. Nia did not offer empty platitudes or useless, patronizing pity. She stepped out of the vehicle radiating an aura of absolute commanding authority. She opened my passenger door, grabbed my canvas suitcase, and firmly ordered me to get into their car. They brought me back to their modern, secure townhouse across the city. Miles gently guided me to the guest bedroom, making sure I ate a warm meal, and finally had a safe, quiet place to sleep without looking over my shoulder. But Nia had a completely different agenda. She immediately transformed her spacious home office into a forensic war room. As a brilliant, high-powered financial investigative lawyer, Nia dealt with massive corporate embezzlement and ruthless white-collar criminals every single day. She was a master at deciphering complex webs of deceit, and she took Damian's actions as a personal insult to her profession. She poured me a cup of hot black tea, handed me a fresh legal pad, and looked me dead in the eyes, promising me that we were going to hunt Damian down and completely dismantle him. While I focused all my remaining energy on simply surviving the agonizing emotional devastation of losing my daily life with Leo, Nia went to work. She began a relentless, meticulous forensic audit of Damian's supposedly hidden financials. She utilized every legal avenue, pulled public corporate filings, and started cross-referencing the holding company Beatrice used to steal my home. Nia sat in front of her multiple glowing monitors late into the night, aggressively determined to follow the massive, convoluted money trail Damian arrogantly thought he had buried forever. She was building the very weapon I would eventually use to strike back, turning their financial warfare into their ultimate undoing. The glow of 3 oversized computer monitors cast long, harsh shadows across the walls of the home office. It was nearly 3 in the morning, exactly 4 days after I had been unceremoniously thrown onto the freezing street by the local police. The house was dead silent, save for the rapid, aggressive clicking of a mechanical keyboard. My sister-in-law, Nia, had barely slept. She was fueled entirely by black coffee and a fierce, righteous indignation on my behalf. I sat curled on the small leather sofa in the corner, wrapped tightly in a heavy fleece blanket, staring blankly at the wall. My mind was a tangled, exhausted mess of trauma and fresh betrayal, but Nia was a machine of pure, unadulterated focus. As a financial investigative lawyer who routinely dismantled corporate fraud syndicates for a living, she navigated the dark, convoluted labyrinth of Damian's offshore accounts and corporate shell companies with ruthless, terrifying precision. Suddenly, the relentless typing stopped. Nia leaned forward, her dark eyes narrowing sharply at the center screen. She hit a few more keys rapidly, cross-referencing a hidden digital ledger she had just managed to pry open through a backdoor routing error Damian's arrogant accountant had carelessly made. She did not say a single word, but the sudden sharp intake of her breath made the hair on the back of my neck stand straight up. She slowly rotated the large monitor toward me, the bright white light illuminating the grim expression on her face. I threw off the heavy blanket and walked over to her desk, my bare feet cold against the polished hardwood floor. On the glowing screen was a scanned, highly confidential medical invoice. It had been buried deep within the financial records of the newly formed subsidiary LLC, owned by Beatrice, intentionally and illegally mislabeled as a generic real estate consulting fee to avoid detection. But the actual original document was undeniably clear. At the very top of the page was the unmistakable, elegant logo of the private fertility clinic. The billing description, printed in stark black ink, read, "Cryopreservation and medical transfer." My heart began to pound a frantic, terrifying rhythm against my ribs. I leaned in closer, my eyes scanning the bottom of the digital document. They're authorizing the immediate and permanent transfer of highly sensitive biological material was my own signature. It was an absolute flawless forgery. My architectural mind immediately took over a survival instinct, desperate to apply structural, rigid logic to the chaotic nightmare unfolding before me. I design intricate, sprawling landscapes. I know exactly how to track complex timelines, how to map out the exact precise sequence of events required to build a foundation or maliciously tear one down. I stared intensely at the date stamped right next to the forged signature. It was dated exactly 1 week before the Thanksgiving dinner. 1 week before Nia found the crumpled hidden receipt in Damian's cashmere coat pocket. 1 week before, I sat in that borrowed car and watched him aggressively and intimately embrace Monica outside the heavy glass clinic doors. The timeline snapped into perfect, devastating alignment, a structural blueprint of pure evil. Damian had not just paid Monica a massive sum of hush money. He had paid for a highly specific, highly illegal medical transfer. The memory of that late-night discovery in the home office suddenly dissolved violently, yanked away by the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of the present-day courtroom. I was slammed forcefully back into the immediate, horrifying reality of my current surroundings. The polished oak tables, the stern, uncompromising face of the presiding judge, and the thick, suffocating tension in the air anchored me firmly back to the present moment. I was sitting at the defendant table, fighting desperately for custody of my existing son, fighting against the cruel, fabricated narrative Damian's lawyers had spun about my mental stability. But all of that carefully orchestrated legal theater instantly evaporated into nothingness. "Mr. Judge, who will the little sister in the freezer live with?" My 6-year-old son's innocent voice echoed off the high vaulted ceilings, hanging in the dead silent air like a dropped guillotine blade. I looked at Leo, clutching his green plush dinosaur, completely oblivious to the catastrophic weight of his own innocent question. I turned my head slowly, looking across the wide center aisle at the man I had once vowed to spend my life with. His arrogant, untouchable facade had completely crumbled into a mask of pure white-hot panic. In the spectator gallery directly behind him, Monica sat entirely frozen, her designer purse spilled messily across the floor, her hands shaking violently in her lap. The forged invoice for cryopreservation and medical transfer, the $15,000 hidden payment, the intimate, desperate embrace outside the fertility clinic, the sudden seamless integration of the head nurse into my ex-husband's private life. The pieces of the shattered puzzle did not just connect. They collided with the destructive, agonizing force of a physical blow directly to my chest. The little sister in the freezer. Leo had overheard Damian and Monica carelessly discussing the frozen assets they had successfully stolen. The remaining two viable female embryos, the absolute last chance I had to bring the daughters I had dreamed of into the world, were not safely preserved in cryogenic storage under my name. They were gone. Damian had forged my signature legally and medically transferring total ownership of my biological children directly to his mistress. The realization crashed over me, a massive tidal wave of pure, unadulterated horror that completely eclipsed the custody battle for my son. I was not just fighting a ruthless hedge fund manager who wanted to take my existing child to punish me. I was looking directly into the cold, dead eyes of a monster who had already successfully stolen my unborn babies. The moment the judge declared the emergency recess, the stifling courtroom erupted into absolute chaos. Damian's high-priced legal team scrambled to gather their scattered files, their faces pale with sudden confusion. I did not waste a single second watching them panic. I grabbed Naya by the arm, my grip tight enough to bruise, and pulled her toward the heavy double doors at the back of the gallery. My heart hammered against my ribs with the violent force of a trapped animal. The horrifying realization that Damian and Monica had stolen my frozen embryos completely overrode my capacity for fear, leaving only a pure, blinding adrenaline. We sprinted down the polished marble corridors of the courthouse, our footsteps echoing sharply against the stone walls. Nia did not ask any questions until we burst through the main exit and hit the cold city air. We ran toward the parking garage, dodging pedestrians and street vendors. As we threw ourselves into her sleek black SUV, I finally managed to force the words past the tight knot in my throat. I explained the forged invoice, the hidden payment, and Leo's chilling question. I told her that Monica was not just Damian's mistress, but the head nurse who had direct physical access to the cryogenic storage facility where my unborn children were kept. Nia slammed the car into drive and ripped out of the parking structure. The tires screeched violently against the concrete. She did not offer empty comfort or useless platitudes. Her dark eyes hardened into chips of pure obsidian, her jaw setting with terrifying determination. The supportive sister-in-law vanished completely, replaced instantly by the ruthless financial investigative lawyer who tore apart corrupt syndicates for a living. She navigated the dense city traffic with aggressive precision, weaving between cars and running yellow lights. The drive was a tense, silent race against a ticking clock. We both knew that Monica had fled the courtroom the exact moment Leo spoke. She had a head start, and she was desperate. We slammed to a halt directly in front of the sleek, modern glass building of the private fertility clinic. It was the exact same facility where I had parked a borrowed car months ago, watching Damian embrace the woman who was secretly dismantling my future. I threw the passenger door open before the SUV was even fully in park. I sprinted across the pavement and pushed aggressively through the heavy revolving doors, Nia trailing just inches behind me. The sterile minimalist waiting room was exactly as I remembered it, but the atmosphere had radically changed. The normally serene, welcoming environment was tense and rigid. I marched directly toward the secure administrative wing, intending to tear through the offices until I found my medical files. But my path was abruptly and physically blocked. Two large, broad-shouldered security guards stood shoulder to shoulder in front of the frosted glass doors. They stepped forward in unison, raising their hands to halt my progress. The taller guard stated in a flat, uncompromising tone that the administrative wing was under a strict temporary lockdown. He informed me that absolutely no unauthorized personnel were allowed past the reception desk. I demanded to see my own personal medical records citing my rights as a registered patient of the clinic. The guard shook his head, his expression entirely unsympathetic. He stated he was acting on direct, urgent orders from the head nurse. Monica had called ahead. She knew exactly what I was coming for, and she had weaponized the clinic's security protocols to build a barricade between me and the truth. I felt a scream rising in my chest. I tried to push past the heavy-set man, my hands connecting with his solid chest, but he easily shoved me backward. I stumbled, my heel catching on the polished tile. Before I could hit the ground, Nia caught me by the shoulders, steadying me with an iron grip. She stepped smoothly in front of me, placing her body between me and the guards. Nia did not raise her voice. She did not scream or lose her composure. Instead, she unleashed a commanding lethal presence that instantly shifted the power dynamic in the room. She adjusted her tailored blazer, looked the taller guard dead in the eyes, and began dismantling his authority with surgical precision. She introduced herself clearly as a federal investigative attorney. She informed the guards that they were currently obstructing the victim of a massive multi-million-dollar medical fraud scheme. Her voice sliced through the quiet waiting room like a perfectly sharpened blade. She did not just threaten them with a lawsuit. She laid out the exact federal statutes they were actively violating by following Monica's orders. She listed severe criminal charges including federal medical tampering, egregious violations of the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, and the unauthorized fraudulent transfer of human genetic material. She stated calmly that if those glass doors were not opened in exactly 10 seconds, she would have a swarm of federal agents and local police officers shutting down the entire medical facility and arresting every single employee blocking our path. The security guards exchanged a highly nervous, uncertain glance. The absolute certainty in Nia's voice combined with her sharp legal terminology made them hesitate. But before they could decide whether to defy their head nurse, the heavy frosted glass doors slid open from the inside. The clinic director, a tall, graying man in a pristine white lab coat, stepped out into the lobby. His face was pale, his eyes darting frantically between Nia and the gathering crowd of concerned patients in the waiting room. He attempted to deploy a calm, authoritative bedside manner, asking us to lower our voices and respect the privacy of the clinic. Nia instantly pivoted her attention to him, completely ignoring his attempt to pacify the situation. She stepped directly into his personal space, invading his comfort zone with terrifying confidence. She informed the director that his head nurse had just fled a family courtroom after being implicated in the theft of viable human embryos. She detailed the forged signature on the cryopreservation transfer documents and the $15,000 payment routed through offshore shell companies. The director's professional facade crumbled entirely. The color drained from his face as the sheer catastrophic liability of Nia's words registered in his mind. Nia leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. She told him that he had exactly one opportunity to protect his medical license and keep himself out of a federal penitentiary. He needed to override Monica's fraudulent lockdown, grant us immediate access to the master administrative logs, and step entirely out of our way. If he chose to protect his head nurse, Nia promised she would personally ensure he was indicted as a co-conspirator in the theft of biological assets. The threat of federal prison and the total destruction of his lucrative medical career broke the director instantly. He visibly swallowed hard, a fine sheen of sweat breaking out across his forehead. He turned to the two security guards and gave a sharp, trembling nod. He ordered them to stand down and return to their normal posts. He reached into his pocket with shaking hands, pulled out his master keycard, and swiped it against the security terminal on the wall. The heavy frosted glass doors clicked loudly, unlocking the path to the administrative wing. The director stepped aside, defeated and terrified. The blockade had been completely dismantled. I looked at Nia, my chest heaving with adrenaline and profound gratitude. She offered me a single sharp nod of encouragement. Without a second of hesitation, we walked past the trembling clinic director and stepped through the doors, plunging directly into the heart of the facility to uncover the absolute darkest depths of Damian and Monica's twisted crime. The clinical chill of the administrative wing hit my skin the moment we crossed the threshold, a stark contrast to the burning adrenaline pumping through my veins. The director's private office was an expansive suite of polished chrome white leather and frosted glass, meticulously designed to project an image of absolute medical integrity. Nia did not give the trembling man a single moment to recover his composure. She directed him straight to his oversized mahogany desk, pointing a sharp, perfectly manicured finger at his secure computer terminal. She demanded the immediate retrieval of the master digital logs and the physical archival file associated with my patient identification number. The director sank heavily into his ergonomic leather chair, his hands shaking so violently he mistyped his administrative password twice. The heavy silence in the room was punctuated only by the frantic clicking of the keyboard and the ragged, shallow breathing of a man realizing his prestigious medical empire was collapsing. He unlocked the lower drawer of a reinforced steel filing cabinet hidden behind his desk and pulled out a thick, heavily sealed manila folder. He slid it across the smooth wooden surface toward me, refusing to make eye contact. I stepped forward, the buzzing in my ears growing deafening. I opened the heavy folder, my eyes darting across pages of highly sensitive medical history lab results and cryogenic storage receipts. As a landscape architect, my brain is fundamentally wired to seek out structural anomalies, to scan complex blueprints for a single flawed, load-bearing wall. I flipped past the initial intake forms until my fingers brushed against a document printed on distinct heavy stock paper. The header read, "Formal consent for cryopreservation and medical transfer." I stared at the bottom of the page, my vision tunneling until nothing else existed in the room. There, resting on the stark black line, was my signature. It was an incredibly sophisticated forgery. To the untrained eye of a clinic administrator, the swooping loops and sharp angles perfectly matched the intake paperwork I had signed years ago. But I knew the unique fluid mechanics of my own handwriting. I could see the unnatural mechanical hesitation in the ink, the slight trembling pauses, where the pen had been meticulously dragged rather than naturally swept across the paper. The legal language above the forged signature was devastatingly absolute. It explicitly stated that I, the biological mother and primary owner of the genetic material, was voluntarily relinquishing all parental rights, custodial claims, and future medical authority over the 2 viable female embryos currently held in cryogenic storage. The document systematically transferred total irrevocable ownership of my unborn biological daughters directly to a third-party recipient. The designated recipient, printed in bold, undeniable text, was Monica. Nia stepped up beside me, her trained investigative eyes scanning the clinical terminology. She recognized the sophisticated structure of the theft instantly. She pointed out the notarization stamp at the bottom of the page, noting that Damian had likely paid off a corrupt notary within his corporate firm to legitimize the fraudulent transfer. The layers of deceit were absolute. He had utilized his vast professional resources to ensure the paperwork would pass any basic administrative audit, effectively shielding Monica from internal suspicion. A wave of profound, suffocating nausea washed over me. The sheer terrifying magnitude of the crime expanded in my mind, revealing a level of psychological depravity that defied basic human reason. I leaned heavily against the mahogany desk, my eyes scanning the attached medical addendums pinned to the back of the transfer document. There, cross-referenced through an internal billing code, was a partial patient profile belonging to Monica herself. The dark, twisted psychology of their collusion suddenly snapped into horrifying focus. Monica, the vibrant 28-year-old head nurse who spent her days administering hormone protocols and monitoring successful implantations, was severely medically infertile. The medical notes indicated a history of irreversible reproductive failure. She was a woman surrounded daily by the miracles of life she helped create for affluent couples, yet entirely incapable of experiencing that biological miracle herself. Damian had exploited that profound desperation to engineer the ultimate theft. As a ruthless hedge fund manager, my ex-husband viewed the entire world exclusively through the lens of assets, liabilities, and return on investment. Divorcing me legally, paying substantial child support for Leo, and funding a brand new, astronomically expensive and statistically uncertain IVF journey with an infertile mistress would have cost him millions of dollars. It would have meant liquidating his carefully guarded offshore wealth and subjecting himself to years of unpredictable medical procedures. Damian demanded a pristine, flawless life without paying the required physical or financial toll. He wanted a perfect new family, and he wanted it immediately. By conspiring to steal our already viable, genetically flawless female embryos, he entirely bypassed the agonizing medical costs, the grueling biological wait, and the financial devastation of a traditional marital split. He did not view my unborn children as human lives. He viewed them as high-yield, liquidated marital assets that could simply be reassigned to a new, more compliant partner. They had literally hijacked my excruciating 4-year medical journey. They had watched me endure the brutal daily injections that left my body bruised and swollen. They had watched me sob through the devastating miscarriages, quietly waiting for the exact moment my body finally produced the perfect, healthy embryos. Then they simply forged a piece of paper and snatched the ultimate prize. The monstrous cruelty of it stole the breath completely from my lungs. Monica was not just sleeping with my husband in a cheap hotel room. She was actively preparing her own body to act as an incubator for my biological children. Damian had orchestrated a reality where he could discard his supposedly broken wife, keep his hidden millions, and build his brand new family using the genetic daughters I had suffered so deeply to create. They had stolen my future, intending to parade my biological children around their elite social circles as their own miraculous creation. I stood in the sterile office, gripping the forged document so tightly, the heavy paper crumpled under my fingers, the cold, hard realization solidifying the absolute destruction of the man I had once loved. The heavy silence in the room was suddenly broken by the sharp scrape of a leather chair pushing violently against the glass floor mat. The clinic director had been watching my face closely, observing the exact moment the horrific reality of the forged consent form settled into my features. He was a man who had built a highly lucrative empire catering to the desperate hopes of the elite, and he recognized instantly that his entire pristine kingdom was about to be seized by federal agents. The sheer gravity of the medical fraud occurring under his direct supervision meant he was facing not only the permanent revocation of his medical license, but decades in a federal penitentiary. I watched his eyes dart nervously toward the heavy metal filing cabinet, then toward the frosted glass door of his office. He began to stammer, his voice thin and thoroughly stripped of its previous arrogant authority. He muttered a frantic, disjointed excuse about needing to retrieve the original wet ink master file from the central archive to cross-reference the notary stamp. He claimed the digital scans and the printed copies we were currently holding would not be sufficient for a formal federal inquiry. Before Naya could firmly object or demand he stay seated, the director slipped past us. He pushed through the heavy office door and disappeared down the sterile, brightly lit hallway, his footsteps moving at an unnaturally rapid pace. Nia immediately pulled out her smartphone, her thumbs flying across the screen as she began photographing every single page of the printed file on the mahogany desk, preserving the immediate evidence. But a cold, terrifying instinct flared to life in the pit of my stomach. My eyes remained locked on the empty doorway. The director was not rushing to assist us in building a federal case against his own head nurse. He was scrambling to protect his clinic from catastrophic liability. He needed to eliminate the only piece of physical evidence that could definitively prove Damian and Monica had committed a federal crime. Without the original document bearing the wet ink forgery, forensic handwriting experts would face massive legal hurdles attempting to testify against my ex-husband based solely on digital scans. The director was racing to destroy the master file. I grabbed Nia by the shoulder, my grip tight and urgent. I told her he was going to the industrial shredder. Nia's head snapped up from her phone, her sharp legal mind instantly recognizing the devastating procedural loophole he was trying to exploit. She demanded to know where the central archives were located, in the sprawling multi-level facility. This is where Damian's absolute arrogance became his ultimate downfall. He had forgotten who I was outside of our home. He had completely overlooked my professional expertise. 2 years prior to this nightmare, the clinic had hired my landscape architecture firm to design and install a therapeutic healing garden in their enclosed central courtyard. It was a massive, highly complex project involving deep root systems, advanced irrigation networks, and heavy stone retaining walls. To ensure my design would not inadvertently compromise the structural integrity of the building's foundation, the city permitting office had required me to meticulously review the complete architectural blueprints of the entire ground floor and the subterranean levels. I had spent weeks studying the exact layout of this medical facility. I knew the placement of every single load-bearing wall, every emergency exit, and every restricted access zone. I knew exactly where the high-density medical archives were buried. I told Nia to follow me. We sprinted out of the executive suite, abandoning any pretense of polite compliance. We bypassed the main patient corridors, entirely pushing aggressively through a set of heavy, unmarked double doors that led into the staff-only service hallways. The atmosphere here was entirely different, devoid of the calming, luxurious aesthetics of the public areas. These corridors were stark industrial and lined with buzzing fluorescent lights and humming medical supply refrigerators. A young technician pushing a cart of sterile linens shouted at us to stop, warning us that we were in a highly restricted zone. Nia did not even break her stride. She flashed her professional credentials without slowing down her commanding presence, parting the medical staff like a physical force. I navigated the maze of identical white hallways solely by memory, tracking our location by the structural support columns I had memorized from the blueprints. We took a sharp left at a junction, then pushed through a heavy fire door that led toward the rear loading docks. The air grew noticeably cooler as we approached the secure sector of the building. My chest was heaving, my lungs burning as we sprinted down a long, narrow passageway. At the very end of the corridor stood a set of reinforced steel doors labeled strictly for authorized records management. As we closed the final distance, a sound echoed through the quiet hallway that made the blood freeze completely solid in my veins. It was the heavy, aggressive mechanical grinding of an industrial-grade paper shredder powering up. It was a loud, hungry noise designed to consume thick stacks of sensitive medical documents and reduce them to meaningless, unrecoverable confetti in a matter of seconds. The director had beaten us to the room. He was already powering up the machine. I did not stop to think. I threw my entire body weight against the heavy steel door. It slammed open, the metal handle crashing violently against the interior cinderblock wall. The archive room was a massive windowless vault filled with towering mechanized shelving units. In the center of the room stood the clinic director. He was pale, sweating profusely, and breathing in ragged, panicked gasps. In his trembling hands, he held a thick, original manila patient folder bearing my name. He had just pulled the forged wet ink consent form from the stack. The industrial shredder beside him roared its steel teeth, waiting to consume the only undeniable proof of my ex-husband's monstrous crime. The director's hand moved forward, lowering the crisp, heavy stock paper toward the lethal blades. The distance between the edge of the forged document and the destructive mechanism was less than an inch. If that paper touched the blades, Damian would win. He would keep his hidden millions. Monica would carry my stolen biological children without consequence, and I would be left completely destitute, entirely erased from my own family's future. The reality of that impending erasure hit me like a physical shockwave, propelling me forward across the harsh concrete floor faster than I had ever moved in my entire life. I slammed my entire body weight into the director's side, my shoulder colliding heavily with his ribs. The sudden, violent impact knocked the breath completely out of him, sending us both crashing hard against the steel casing of the industrial shredder. The thick manila folder flew from his trembling hands, scattering its highly sensitive contents across the cold concrete floor. I scrambled frantically on my hands and knees, ignoring the sharp shooting pain radiating up my arm. My fingers clamped down hard on the heavy stock paper just a fraction of a second before the machine's automated intake feed could pull it into the spinning metal teeth. I ripped the forged consent form backward, pulling it safely against my chest. My heart pounded so violently I could hear the blood rushing loudly in my ears. The clinic director scrambled backward across the floor, panting heavily, realizing he had just physically engaged a patient while actively attempting to destroy undeniable evidence of a federal crime. Nia was there instantly. She did not yell. She simply reached down, took the forged document from my shaking hands, and slid it smoothly into a clear, tamper-proof legal folder she had pulled directly from her tailored briefcase. She looked down at the cowering director and informed him in a voice as cold as liquid nitrogen that his prestigious medical career was officially over. She instructed him to sit on the floor and not move a single muscle unless he wanted to add assaulting a federal officer of the court to his rapidly growing list of criminal charges. He obeyed immediately, burying his pale face in his trembling hands. As I leaned back against the cold cinderblock wall, trying desperately to catch my breath, a sharp, intrusive sound pierced the heavy atmosphere of the archive room. My cell phone was vibrating aggressively in my coat pocket. I pulled it out, my eyes locking instantly onto the bright screen. The caller identification displayed Damian's name. A fresh, sickening wave of absolute disgust washed over me. He was calling to gloat. He undoubtedly assumed I was currently sitting in a depressing courthouse hallway, destitute, broken, and crying over the temporary recess that was merely delaying his inevitable custody victory. I looked up at Nia, turning the glowing screen toward her. Her sharp investigative instincts activated instantly. She reached into her blazer, pulling out her own secondary work phone. She tapped the screen, quickly opening a high-grade audio recording application used for capturing legal depositions. She nodded firmly at me, gesturing for me to answer the call and place it on speakerphone. She mouthed a single clear directive to let him talk. I pressed the green button, holding the phone steady between us in the echoing concrete room. I did not say a word. I let the heavy silence stretch out, forcing him to fill the void. Damian's voice poured out of the small speaker, dripping with that familiar, arrogant condescension. He asked me how I was enjoying my temporary reprieve. He mocked the emergency recess, calling Leo's interruption a pathetic, highly coached stunt that I had supposedly orchestrated to delay the inevitable. He promised me with absolute certainty that the judge was going to strip me of my maternal rights the moment we returned to the courtroom. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper, forcing myself to remain completely and utterly silent. The old melody, the desperate wife who had spent years begging for his basic approval and validation, would have screamed. She would have cried, demanded answers, and pleaded for mercy. But that woman died the moment I saw my forged signature. In her place stood a mother who had just secured the physical proof of his monstrous crimes. My absolute silence unsettled him slightly, but his colossal ego quickly overrode any basic caution. He interpreted my lack of response as total, crushing defeat. Emboldened by what he assumed was my absolute despair, Damian escalated his cruelty to an entirely new level. He wanted to ensure my psychological destruction was permanent. His voice dropped to a low, vicious tone. He told me that fighting him was entirely pointless because he was already building a new perfect life without my defective genetics dragging him down. He explicitly and proudly announced that Monica was already well into her first trimester with a highly successful, perfectly healthy pregnancy. He did not stop there. He gloated about the future, describing in agonizing detail how Monica was going to give him the beautiful, flawless daughter I never could. He boasted that Leo was going to have a brand new loving mother and a brand new baby sister. He painted a grotesque picture of their impending domestic bliss, explicitly stating that Monica's body was doing exactly what mine had failed to do. He bragged that he had secured everything he ever wanted without having to split a single dime of his hard-earned wealth with an unstable failure like me. He confidently promised that within a year my son would not even remember my name. He vowed I would be completely and permanently erased from their perfect family portrait. Every single vile word that spilled from his mouth was being perfectly captured by the digital recorder in Nia's steady hand. Damian was freely admitting to the exact timeline of the pregnancy. He was establishing undeniable financial and personal motive. He was actively confirming that he viewed my stolen biological embryos as his own exclusive property, a brand new family he had procured with his mistress. He was voluntarily handing us the exact psychological and chronological evidence required to lock him in a federal penitentiary for the next decade. I listened to the man I had once loved lay out his entire twisted fantasy. I did not shed a single tear. I did not offer him the satisfaction of hearing my voice break or my breath hitch. I simply let him finish his arrogant, toxic monologue. When he finally paused, waiting eagerly for the sound of my sobbing, I took a slow, deep breath. I spoke exactly one sentence in a tone so flat and devoid of emotion that it sounded entirely unrecognizable even to my own ears. I told him I would see him very soon. I ended the call before he could utter another syllable. The archive room fell silent again, save for the pathetic whimpering of the ruined clinic director on the floor. Nia stopped the recording safely, saving the audio file to an encrypted cloud server. She looked at me, a profound respect shining in her dark eyes. We had the forged wet ink document. We had the clinic director cornered in his own vault. And now we had Damian's own arrogant self-incriminating confession permanently captured on tape. The vicious ambush he had planned for my life had officially become the very trap that would destroy his. We left the clinic director trembling on the cold concrete floor of his own vault, completely broken by the sheer weight of his own criminal liability. Nia did not offer him a single parting glance as we walked out of the heavy steel doors, the clear tamper-proof folder containing my forged signature clutched safely against her chest. The drive back across the city to the secure townhouse she shared with my brother Miles was conducted in absolute profound silence. It was not the heavy, suffocating silence of defeat that had choked me just hours prior. It was the sharp, charged quiet of a loaded weapon waiting to be fired. The moment I stepped through the front door of their home, the final lingering remnants of my suffocating grief evaporated completely. The agonizing sorrow that had kept me awake for nights on end was violently burned away, entirely replaced by a cold, tactical precision. I walked into the guest bathroom, looked at my exhausted reflection in the mirror, and made a silent, unbreakable vow. I refused to shed another tear for a man who viewed my biological children as stolen commodities. Miles was waiting for us in the kitchen. As a protective older brother, his first instinct had always been to shield me from pain. But when he looked into my eyes that afternoon, he did not see the shattered, weeping sister he had taken in days ago. He saw a woman who had just obtained the blueprints to her enemy's fortress. I walked directly past the kitchen and straight into Nia's home office. We immediately transformed the spacious room into a highly classified command center. The next 7 days dissolved into a blur of absolute, ruthless, systematic preparation. We treated the entire operation with the exact same meticulous, uncompromising scrutiny that I applied to my most complex architectural landscapes. Every single piece of evidence had to be perfectly placed, solidly grounded, and completely unassailable. We started by mapping out the timeline on a massive whiteboard covering the entire length of the office wall. Nia printed out the high-resolution photographs of the forged medical consent form, pinning them to the center of the board. I stared at the crude imitation of my own handwriting, feeling nothing but a chilling clinical detachment. We flanked the forgery with the printed forensic financial trails Nia had painstakingly extracted from the hidden offshore accounts. We traced the exact, undeniable path of the $15,000 payment from Damian's secretive shell company directly to the fertility clinic's billing department. Every single dollar was accounted for, demonstrating a clear, premeditated financial transaction for the illegal transfer of human genetic material. The crown jewel of our rapidly expanding arsenal was the audio file captured on Nia's secondary device. We played Damian's arrogant, venomous phone call on a loop, listening to him freely and proudly admit to the entire timeline of Monica's pregnancy. We transcribed every single vicious taunt, every explicit confirmation that he had orchestrated this horrific crime to avoid paying child support and splitting our marital assets. He had handed us his undisputed motive method and opportunity wrapped in a tidy, self-incriminating bow. Nia backed up the audio recording and the digital scans across 3 separate highly encrypted cloud servers, ensuring Damian could never wipe the evidence from existence. The original wet ink document was locked securely inside a heavy fireproof safe bolted to the floor of the office. With the physical evidence perfectly structured, Nia activated her extensive professional network. As a formidable African-American financial investigative lawyer who routinely collaborated with federal authorities to dismantle corporate fraud, she possessed a reputation for absolute terrifying integrity. She bypassed the local municipal courts entirely, knowing Damian's vast wealth could easily buy off a low-level county judge or stall the proceedings through endless expensive bureaucratic red tape. Instead, she took our meticulously organized file directly to a trusted federal prosecutor she had worked alongside for years. When the prosecutor heard Damian's recorded confession and reviewed the undeniable paper trail of the forged medical transfer, the response was swift and devastating. Nia utilized her commanding legal influence to secure highly classified sealed federal search warrants. The charges being quietly prepared were catastrophic. Damian and Monica were not going to face a simple family court dispute over child custody. They were being actively investigated for severe federal medical fraud, criminal identity theft, and interstate wire fraud. The sealed nature of the warrants was a crucial tactical masterpiece. It meant Damian's expensive corporate lawyers had absolutely no idea that a massive federal hammer was currently hovering just inches above his arrogant head. He still genuinely believed he was winning. He still thought I was completely destitute and broken. While Nia managed the complex federal legal maneuvers, I focused entirely on transforming my own physical and psychological demeanor. I stopped pacing the hardwood floors. I started eating proper meals, forcing my body to regain the strength it had lost during the initial shock of the betrayal. I threw away the comfortable, oversized sweaters I had been hiding in and asked Miles to purchase a striking, immaculately tailored outfit for me. I was preparing myself mentally for the ultimate public confrontation. I knew exactly how Damian's mind operated. He was a creature of intense vanity and social hierarchy. Confronting him in a sterile courtroom or a quiet lawyer's office would allow him to maintain his carefully cultivated facade of elite superiority. He would simply deploy his legal team to quietly manage the fallout behind closed doors. I refused to allow him that luxury. He had publicly destroyed my reputation, weaponizing his mother's wealthy social circles to paint me as an unstable addict. He had intentionally isolated me from my community and attempted to use that very isolation to steal my existing son. The only acceptable retribution was total, undeniable public annihilation. I needed an audience. I needed the very people he sought to impress to witness his complete destruction in real time. I needed to detonate the explosive evidence we had gathered on the largest, most spectacular stage possible. I sat in the glow of the computer monitors studying Damian's upcoming social calendar that Nia had managed to intercept. I was waiting with cold architectural patience for the perfect moment to strike. I was looking for an event so opulent, so highly publicized, that his pristine public facade would shatter into a million unrecoverable pieces the moment I walked through the doors. And as my eyes scanned a digital invitation forwarded to his primary email account, a slow, icy smile spread across my face. I had found the exact location for his public execution. The Oakmont Country Club sat perched on a manicured hilltop, an imposing fortress of old money, towering stone pillars, and absolute exclusivity. It was the exact kind of high society sanctuary Damian and Beatrice utilized to flaunt their wealth and solidify their social dominance. On a brisk Saturday afternoon, the sprawling estate had been entirely transformed to host the most arrogant, superficially extravagant celebration imaginable. They were hosting a grand gender reveal party, a grotesque victory lap disguised as a joyous family milestone. Valets rushed frantically up and down the sweeping circular driveway, parking an endless gleaming line of imported luxury vehicles. Inside the country club, the grand ballroom was draped in cascading oceans of pastel pink and blue silk. Massive, towering floral arrangements of imported orchids and white roses dominated every single table, filling the warm air with a cloying, heavy perfume. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos circulated smoothly through the dense crowd, carrying polished silver trays loaded with vintage champagne, beluga caviar, and delicate hors d'oeuvres. In the very center of the room sat a massive opaque cannon, waiting to blast colored confetti over the audience to announce the stolen child's gender. The guest list was a meticulously curated roster of the city's absolute elite. Damian had invited his wealthiest hedge fund investors, high-profile local politicians, prominent corporate executives, and the most influential power brokers in the state. He was actively using this fabricated domestic miracle to project an image of pristine family stability, a highly calculated move designed specifically to attract even more millions into his aggressive financial portfolios. Beatrice held court near the towering champagne fountain, reveling in the intoxicating glow of high society attention. She wore a custom-tailored emerald designer gown, her chest adorned with heavy antique diamond jewelry that caught the light with her every movement. She had Monica pinned firmly to her side, parading the 28-year-old mistress around the room like a newly acquired, highly prized show pony. Monica was draped in a clinging blush-colored maternity dress, resting her manicured hands tenderly over the slight swell of her stomach. She looked flushed with victory, eagerly soaking in the lavish praise and absolute luxury that her federal crimes had successfully purchased. Beatrice's voice echoed shrilly over the soft melodic classical music playing in the background. She boasted endlessly to a captivated audience of wealthy pearl-wearing socialites about the absolute miracle of this pregnancy. She proudly proclaimed that her son was finally getting the perfect, healthy family he had always deserved. She explicitly framed Monica as a savior, a vibrant, flawless woman who was actively securing the prestigious family legacy without any of the messy clinical complications of the past. Beatrice leaned in close to the wife of a prominent state senator, whispering loudly about how incredibly blessed they were to have moved past the dark, unstable era of Damian's previous marriage. The catering staff moved with silent and visible efficiency, ensuring no guest ever held an empty glass. The irony of the opulent setting was physically sickening. Every single dollar funding this extravagant display of wealth, the imported caviar, the silk drapery, the massive venue rental fee had been stolen directly from my marital assets. Damian was utilizing the exact funds he had illegally siphoned from our joint accounts to publicly celebrate the theft of my biological children. He had effectively forced me to finance the high society unveiling of his mistress and the baby they had stolen from my body. Monica smiled demurely as a group of wealthy wives complimented her glowing complexion, her eyes sparkling with the thrill of having successfully infiltrated the upper class. She had permanently traded her sterile clinic scrubs for designer maternity wear, genuinely believing she had outsmarted a federal medical system and walked away with a billionaire lifestyle. The guests fawned over them, entirely oblivious to the dark, horrifying reality resting just beneath the surface of the lavish celebration. They raised their crystal goblets, offering glowing, heartfelt toasts to the happy couple. They praised Damian's remarkable resilience and complimented Monica's radiant maternal glow. The sheer, suffocating superficiality of the room was staggering. These were people who valued pristine appearances and bank account balances far above basic human decency. They were individuals who had eagerly swallowed the toxic, vicious lies Beatrice had spread about my supposed mental collapse and addiction. They were blindly celebrating the successful theft of my biological children, treating my stolen future as a delightful afternoon society spectacle. Across the expansive ballroom, Damian was operating at the absolute peak of his narcissistic power. He moved smoothly from group to group, slapping the backs of prominent investors and shaking hands firmly with local dignitaries. He projected the aura of a man who had successfully conquered the world. He was completely drunk on his own perceived brilliance. In his mind, he had executed a flawless financial and biological heist. He believed he had successfully discarded a broken, defective wife, kept every single penny of his hidden offshore wealth, and procured a brand new, genetically perfect family without paying any consequences whatsoever. He stopped to speak with the chief executive officer of a major tech conglomerate pitching a massive new investment fund while casually referencing his growing family as proof of his reliability and long-term vision. He laughed loudly at a joke made by a city councilman exuding an absolute, impenetrable, false sense of security. He truly believed he was untouchable. He thought the heavy oak doors and the armed private security guards of the country club shielded him from any possible repercussions. He looked at Monica from across the room, raising his champagne flute to her in a silent, arrogant toast to their shared monstrous victory. The sheer arrogance of their opulent display was a magnificent, incredibly fragile house of cards waiting for a single powerful strike. Damian and Beatrice had gathered the most influential, wealthy, and gossip-hungry individuals in the entire state into one single inescapable room. Damian had meticulously arranged the exact audience required for his own total social and professional annihilation. Every single investor he was currently charming, every politician he was currently attempting to bribe with his pristine family image, was about to become a direct first-hand witness to his devastating federal crimes. The stage was set perfectly. The pastel silk decorations, the expensive vintage champagne, the arrogant boasting the gentle classical music, it all formed the ultimate tragic backdrop for the absolute reckoning that was currently waiting just outside the venue. The false security blanketing the opulent ballroom was heavy and absolute, creating a sickeningly perfect contrast to the catastrophic reality that was about to tear through their pristine stolen world. My name is Melody, and as I pulled into the circular driveway of the Oakmont Country Club, bringing the car to a halt behind a line of luxury sedans, I did not wait for the valet. I stepped into the crisp afternoon air, the sharp click of my heels striking the cobblestone echoing with undeniable authority. The woman violently evicted onto the freezing streets was completely gone. In her place stood a successful landscape architect who knew exactly how to reclaim her territory. I wore an impeccably tailored emerald green power suit that commanded immediate attention, my hair styled in a sleek blowout. I projected an aura of untouchable dominance. I was not there to negotiate with the man who stole my biological future. I was there to execute flawless demolition. The private security detail at the grand entrance consisted of two broad-shouldered men holding digital tablets containing the highly exclusive guest list. Damian had undoubtedly given them rigorous instructions to deny me entry, but men who guard the elite are trained to look for hesitation for the shifting energy of an unwanted interloper. I gave them nothing of the sort. I did not slow my pace or avert my gaze. I looked straight through them, radiating the sheer entitlement of a woman who owned the very ground she walked on. I glided past the heavy mahogany doors before their minds could register that I was not a wealthy donor or a hedge fund investor. I bypassed their blockade with raw, lethal confidence. I stepped over the threshold into the massive, opulent ballroom. The atmosphere was thick, saturated with the scent of white roses and the dull hum of superficial chatter. I stood at the top of the grand staircase, overlooking the sea of pastel silk and glittering chandeliers. In my right hand, I held a sleek leather folder. It was incredibly light, yet contained the inescapable weight of federal justice. Inside rested the court-stamped search warrants, the financial audit Nia had prepared, and the undeniable proof of the forged medical transfer documents. It was the physical manifestation of my former husband's complete destruction. I descended the stairs with a slow, predatory grace, scanning the dense crowd of oblivious socialites and corporate executives. It did not take long for the polished crowd to register my presence. The reaction rippled through the ballroom like a sudden drop in temperature. As I walked deliberately through the throngs of people holding crystal champagne flutes, the polite conversations died a rapid, unnatural death. Heads turned sharply. Cold eyes swept over my emerald suit. The whispers broke out immediately, spreading like wildfire across the venue. I could hear the hushed, scandalized murmurs of Beatrice's country club friends as I passed their tables. I heard them calling me the unstable former wife. I heard the toxic rumors of my supposed addiction and mental collapse being passed from one perfectly glossed mouth to another. They looked at me with a mixture of horror and morbid fascination, expecting me to cause a frantic, drunken scene. I did not flinch. I did not lower my chin or quicken my pace. I welcomed their harsh stares, feeding on the absolute irony of their misplaced disgust. They were actively shunning the victim while eagerly drinking the expensive champagne paid for by a ruthless federal criminal. I continued my slow, methodical walk directly toward the center of the room, parting the sea of elite guests with the sheer force of my composure. I was an architect walking straight into the center of a condemned building, simply waiting to detonate the structural charges. Damian was standing near the massive gender reveal cannon holding a fresh drink and laughing loudly at a joke made by a prominent city councilman. He turned his head casually, his eyes sweeping the crowd, and then he froze completely. The crystal goblet slipped slightly in his grip, spilling a splash of vintage champagne onto his custom-tailored trousers. The arrogant, untouchable smirk he had worn all afternoon evaporated in a fraction of a second. I watched his face contort violently, cycling rapidly from profound shock to sheer, unadulterated panic, and finally settling into a mask of pure, unhinged rage. He realized instantly that his impenetrable fortress had been breached. He snapped his fingers aggressively, signaling frantically to the private security guards stationed near the catering exits. He did not wait for them to reach me. Damian abandoned the confused city councilman and marched aggressively across the ballroom floor, his face flushed an ugly shade of crimson. He closed the distance between us in seconds, stopping just inches from my face. He leaned in, his breath reeking of expensive alcohol, his voice dropping to a harsh hiss meant only for my ears. He demanded to know what I was doing in his venue. He ordered me to turn around and walk out the door immediately, threatening to have the police throw me in a jail cell for criminal trespassing. He tried to loom over me, deploying the exact same physical intimidation tactics he had used the night he threw me out. I stood my ground flawlessly. My heart maintained a slow, steady, and calm rhythm. I did not take a single step backward. I looked up into his panicked, furious eyes, my own expression devoid of any fear or submission. I tightened my grip on the sleek leather folder containing his imminent federal indictment. I told him in a voice as cold as ice that I was not going anywhere. I informed him that I was simply here to witness the grand reveal he had so meticulously planned. I watched his chest heave with raw anger as the heavy security guards finally broke through the crowd, reaching out to grab my arms and forcibly remove me from the premises. He had absolutely no idea that his entire reality was already completely over, and that the devastating, undeniable truth was about to violently dismantle his perfectly stolen world forever. The hands of the private security guards clamped down on my shoulders. Damian's face twisted into a victorious sneer, but he had underestimated his mother's theatrical planning. As the guards began pulling me backward, the crystal chandeliers above us dimmed dramatically. A booming voice echoed through the surround sound system, demanding the attention of every guest. The master of ceremonies excitedly announced that it was time for the ultimate surprise. The crowd erupted into a deafening roar of applause, entirely drowning out Damian's frantic orders to remove me. Beatrice rushed forward in emerald silk, physically yanking Damian toward the center stage for the family photo opportunity. The surge of eager guests pressing forward broke the security guard's grip on my suit jacket. The master of ceremonies began a countdown from 10, 9. The wealthy investors and socialites joined in chanting the numbers in unison. 8, 7. I slipped effortlessly through the distracted crowd, moving with the calculated precision of a predator zeroing in on its prey. 6, 5. Damian stood on the platform, his arm wrapped tightly around Monica's waist, forcing a strained smile for the flashing cameras, while his eyes darted across the sea of faces. 4, 3. I stepped up to the edge of the control deck, unnoticed by the sound technicians focused on the pyrotechnics. 2, 1. A deafening blast shook the foundation of the country club. The massive gender reveal cannons mounted on the corners of the stage erupted simultaneously. A hurricane of metallic pink confetti blasted into the warm air, raining down over the overjoyed crowd. It was a girl. The ballroom exploded with euphoric cheers and the popping of champagne corks. Monica buried her face in her hands, weeping theatrical tears of joy as Beatrice hugged her fiercely. In that exact fraction of a second, while the room was blinded by the pink silk, and deafened by their celebratory roars, I bypassed the security perimeter entirely. I stepped firmly up the side stairs and walked directly onto the main stage. I walked straight past the celebrating criminals moving directly toward the audiovisual control podium resting at the center of the platform. The lead technician looked up in sheer confusion, but I did not give him a chance to object. With a swift motion, I disconnected the main visual feed cable that was projecting a live, smiling image of Damian and Monica. I reached into my leather folder, pulled out my encrypted flash drive, and shoved it aggressively into the projection port. I bypassed their colorful slideshow of domestic bliss and triggered my own presentation. The colossal LED screens spanning the width of the ballroom flickered to black for a split second. Then, an incredibly high-resolution scan of a sterile medical document illuminated the venue in stark, unforgiving white light. The private fertility clinic's recognizable logo was projected at 20 times its normal size. The cheering crowd began to falter their enthusiastic applause, tapering off into a confused, scattered murmur. Behind me, I heard Damian let out a strangled gasp. I pressed a button on the control deck highlighting specific sections of the projected document in bright yellow marker. The massive screens explicitly displayed the formal consent for cryopreservation and medical transfer. It prominently featured the perfectly forged wet ink signature, transferring total ownership of human genetic material directly to Monica. I seized the primary microphone from its heavy metal stand. The sudden movement caused a sharp, piercing whine of audio feedback to shriek through the expensive speakers. The grating sound violently sliced through the remaining celebratory chatter, bringing the entire opulent ballroom to a dead, horrified halt. Hundreds of elite guests stood entirely frozen pink confetti still drifting lazily down onto their designer clothes. The silence was thick and suffocating. I gripped the microphone tightly, stepping away from the podium and walking to the absolute center of the stage. I stood exactly 3 feet away from my ex-husband and his trembling mistress. I looked out over the sea of wealthy investors and prominent politicians who had spent the afternoon gossiping about my fabricated mental collapse. My voice echoed through the silent, shocked ballroom, ringing out with a cold, terrifying clarity that offered absolutely no mercy. I welcomed everyone to this spectacular celebration of life, my tone dripping with pure, concentrated venom. I told the captivated audience that they were all brought here today to witness a supposed medical miracle, to celebrate the incredible resilience of a man who had bravely moved on from his unstable, defective wife. I gestured toward the massive LED screens illuminating the room behind me, demanding that every single person look closely at the heavily guarded truth Damian had been hiding. I explained exactly what they were looking at, detailing the clinical forgery, the hidden $15,000 payment to a corrupt head nurse, and the highly illegal transfer of my most protected biological assets. Damian stood completely paralyzed, his mouth opening and closing without a single sound escaping his throat. Monica was shaking so violently that her knees visibly buckled, forcing her to grab onto the confetti-covered table just to stay upright. Beatrice looked as though she had been physically struck, her aristocratic face contorting in sheer horror as the women she had lied to all afternoon stared back at her in absolute disgust. I raised the microphone closer to my mouth, ensuring every single syllable would be permanently burned into the memories of the city's elite. I announced to the hundreds of powerful guests standing before me that there was no medical miracle happening today. I stated with unwavering conviction that the beautiful baby girl Monica was currently carrying in her womb was not a product of their loving new relationship. I declared loudly and clearly that Damian and Monica had committed a massive federal crime, exploiting a medical facility to completely bypass the law. The miracle baby girl Monica is carrying, I announced, my voice cutting through the opulent room like a diamond-tipped blade, is in fact my stolen biological child. The collective gasp that erupted from the crowd sounded like the oxygen being violently sucked out of the room, sealing their absolute ruin. The collective gasp that erupted from the crowd did not fade into silence. Instead, it instantly morphed into a deafening, chaotic uproar. The elite socialites and powerful investors who had just been eagerly toasting Damian's supposed success violently recoiled as if they had been physically burned. The metallic pink confetti that had signaled a joyous high society occasion now felt like the toxic fallout of a horrific crime scene. I stood tall on the main stage, the microphone still loose in my firm grip, looking down at the absolute pandemonium I had ignited. The disgust on the faces of the city councilmen and corporate executives was incredibly palpable. They were rapidly calculating the devastating social and professional liability of being photographed in the same room as a man who had stolen his ex-wife's unborn children. The sheer reality of his public annihilation finally pierced Damian's thick, impenetrable shell of arrogance. His ashen face flooded with a dark, violent shade of crimson. His self-preservation instincts kicked in, but they were entirely erratic and unhinged. He let out a furious, guttural shout, a primal sound completely devoid of his usual polished corporate charm. He shoved aggressively past a stunned state senator, knocking a tray of expensive vintage champagne from a terrified waiter's hands, and lunged directly toward the main stage. His eyes were wide and wild, fixated entirely on me, and the glowing projection of his forged medical document illuminating the massive LED screens. He desperately wanted to leap onto the platform to physically silence the undeniable truth. He did not even make it to the first wooden step of the platform. A loud, authoritative boom echoed from the rear of the opulent ballroom, cutting sharply through the chaotic shouts of the wealthy guests. The heavy mahogany double doors of the country club were violently thrust open. The pristine, highly guarded illusion of the high society sanctuary was instantly shattered as a highly coordinated swarm of uniformed local police officers and tactical federal agents poured into the venue. The flashing red and blue emergency lights of the cruisers parked right outside reflected intensely against the crystal chandeliers, painting the terrified faces of the elite crowd in alternating colors of a federal raid. At the very front of the tactical law enforcement formation strode my sister-in-law, Nia. She moved with the terrifying, majestic authority of an absolute apex predator who had finally cornered her prey. Her dark eyes were locked entirely on Damian. She held up her official federal investigative badge with one hand and pointed a sharp, unwavering finger directly at the disgraced hedge fund manager with the other. She did not need to shout to establish control over the panicked room. Her commanding, lethal presence alone parted the sea of frantic socialites and wealthy investors like a physical force. The elite crowd, absolutely desperate to distance themselves from a federal target, scrambled aggressively out of the way, leaving Damian entirely exposed and isolated in the center of the plush, confetti-covered carpet. Damian realized in a fraction of a second that his violent advance toward me had completely failed. His predatory rage morphed instantly into the pathetic, frantic desperation of a trapped coward. He spun around rapidly, his expensive Italian leather shoes slipping slightly on the fallen pink silk decorations covering the floor, and attempted to sprint toward the rear catering exits. It was a completely futile, utterly humiliating effort. 3 heavily armored federal agents intercepted his path before he could take more than 5 frantic steps. The spectacular physical payoff of his destruction unfolded right in front of the very people he had spent years trying to manipulate and impress. A broad-shouldered federal agent grabbed the collar of Damian's custom-tailored suit jacket and aggressively hurled him forward. Damian slammed violently against a long linen-draped table laden with imported beluga caviar and an elaborate ice sculpture. The heavy impact shattered a perfectly arranged pyramid of crystal glasses, sending sharp shards and expensive vintage wine raining down over his pristine clothing. The massive swan ice sculpture collapsed, crashing onto the hardwood floor with a deafening thud that sent freezing water splashing across his designer shoes. He grunted loudly in pain, struggling helplessly against the firm, unyielding grip of the authorities. The agents forcefully pinned his broad shoulders against the damp, ruined catering table, wrenching his arms roughly behind his back. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs locking securely around his wrists echoed through the room with profound, deeply satisfying finality. The lead federal investigator stepped forward, pulling a thick stack of court-stamped documents from his tactical jacket. His voice boomed across the silenced, utterly horrified ballroom, ensuring every single prominent investor, politician, and socialite heard the exact, excruciating details of Damian's ruin. He loudly recited the devastating litany of severe criminal charges. Damian was being formally arrested for federal medical fraud, criminal identity theft, the illegal and fraudulent transfer of human genetic material, and massive financial embezzlement. The investigator explicitly detailed how Damian had utilized illegal offshore shell companies to secretly finance a horrific medical crime, deliberately defrauding both a protected medical facility and his former spouse. I watched from the stage as the very foundation of Damian's elite status dissolved into absolute nothingness. The chief executive officer of the tech conglomerate, the specific man Damian had been charming just minutes prior in hopes of securing a massive investment fund, took several disgusted steps backward, aggressively pulling his wife away from the grotesque scene. The wealthy clients who had blindly entrusted Damian with their massive financial portfolios were already pulling out their smartphones, frantically typing urgent messages to their own legal teams to pull their capital from his corrupt management firm. In the span of a few highly chaotic minutes, his incredibly lucrative, prestigious career as a hedge fund manager was instantly and permanently eradicated. No sane financial institution or private investor would ever trust him with a single dime again. Damian lay pinned against the ruined catering table, his cheek pressed firmly into the spilled caviar and shattered crystal glass. The arrogant, untouchable smirk he had worn confidently since the very day he threw me out of our marital home was entirely erased from his features. He looked exceptionally pathetic, stripped of all his corporate armor and societal power. He was no longer a wealthy elite celebrating a fabricated miracle family. He was a handcuffed, publicly disgraced felon who had been caught orchestrating a deeply depraved crime. The flashing emergency lights from the parking lot illuminated his inescapable humiliation, casting stark shadows across the opulent room he had rented to celebrate his twisted victory. I stood firmly at the audiovisual podium, my emerald green suit perfectly pristine, my breathing steady and remarkably calm. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or remorse for the man bleeding slightly onto the white linen tablecloth. I had spent 6 agonizing months surviving the profound emotional devastation he had purposefully inflicted upon me. I had endured the terrifying isolation of his calculated smear campaign and the absolute despair of having my financial independence severed in the middle of the cold night. Now he was experiencing the exact total ruin he had meticulously designed for me. The heavy scales of justice had not just carefully balanced. They had slammed down upon him with terrifying absolute and undeniable force. As Damian was firmly pinned against the ruined catering table, the immediate shockwave of his federal arrest violently fractured whatever fragile composure remained in the opulent ballroom. I shifted my gaze from the shattered ice sculpture directly to Beatrice. The undisputed matriarch of the suburban elite was currently experiencing the total catastrophic collapse of her entire high society universe in real time. She stood completely paralyzed near the towering champagne fountain, clutching her designer purse so tightly. Her knuckles mirrored the stark white of the linen tablecloths. The prominent politicians, the wealthy investors, and the pearl-wearing socialites she had spent decades meticulously courting were now actively backing away from her. They moved with a synchronized, palpable disgust, treating the woman they had just praised as though she were a highly contagious, lethal disease. The absolute isolation Beatrice had so gleefully orchestrated for me at her Thanksgiving dinner had officially become her own permanent reality. I watched her aristocratic facade violently disintegrate. Her custom-tailored emerald gown suddenly looked like a pathetic, ill-fitting costume, and the heavy antique diamonds resting against her collarbone appeared to weigh her down like physical chains. In the ruthless, superficial world, Beatrice inhabited social currency was the only currency that truly mattered, and she had just been rendered entirely and publicly bankrupt. Desperation is a terrifying catalyst, and Beatrice was completely desperate to salvage even a single shred of her pristine reputation. Her survival instincts kicked in, demanding an immediate disposable scapegoat to absorb the catastrophic fallout of the federal raid. She found that scapegoat standing absolutely frozen just a few feet away. Monica was trembling violently in her blush-colored maternity dress, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror as she watched federal agents read her lover his Miranda rights. Beatrice pivoted aggressively toward the 28-year-old mistress, her perfectly powdered face contorting into a mask of pure, unhinged ferocity. She completely abandoned her refined, wealthy persona, unleashing a torrent of vicious, unfiltered venom. Her shrill voice sliced through the heavy tension of the ballroom, echoing loudly over the chaotic murmur of the crowd. She pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at Monica, screaming that this entire federal nightmare was the fault of a manipulative, lower-class clinic nurse. Beatrice ruthlessly discarded the woman she had proudly paraded around the venue mere minutes prior, vehemently denying any prior knowledge of the forged medical documents or the stolen embryos. The matriarch's desperation rapidly escalated from verbal abuse to sheer physical violence. Beatrice lunged forward with shocking speed, raising her manicured hand high into the air, attempting to aggressively slap the mistress across the face for dragging their prestigious family name into a disgusting federal scandal. She shrieked that Monica was a parasitic gold digger who had maliciously seduced her son and orchestrated the theft of my biological property to trap a wealthy man. Before her hand could connect with Monica's cheek, a female federal agent intercepted the strike. The agent grabbed Beatrice by the wrist, forcefully, twisting her arm backward and ordering her to stand down immediately. The humiliating spectacle of the wealthy matriarch fighting physically against a federal officer in the middle of her own extravagant country club party was a poetic, devastating execution of ultimate karma. The physical altercation and the aggressive presence of law enforcement finally shattered Monica's fragile grip on reality. The terrifying gravity of the situation crashed down upon her shoulders, crushing her completely. She was not going to be a wealthy hedge fund manager's pampered wife. She was going to be a convicted federal felon permanently stripped of her medical license and facing years in a high-security penitentiary. Monica began to hyperventilate rapidly, her chest heaving as she gasped for oxygen in the suffocatingly tense room. She looked around wildly, finding absolutely no sympathy in the cold, judgmental stares of the country club elite. In a moment of pure, pathetic desperation, Monica turned her frantic gaze toward the main stage. She stumbled forward, her legs giving out completely as she reached the bottom of the wooden steps. She dropped heavily to her knees on the confetti-covered floor, looking up at me with tears streaming rapidly down her flushed cheeks. The woman who had callously stolen my most sensitive medical files, who had slept with my husband while actively preparing her body to serve as a fraudulent incubator for my genetic children, was now crawling on the ground before me. Monica clasped her hands together, sobbing hysterically as she begged me for mercy. She pleaded with me in a ragged, broken voice, begging me not to force her to terminate the pregnancy or allow the federal authorities to take the baby away from her once she was incarcerated. She cried that she had wanted a child for so long, aggressively attempting to use her own medical infertility as a desperate, manipulative excuse for committing a monstrous, unforgivable crime against another mother. She looked up at me, waiting for the inherent kindness she assumed I still possessed, hoping I would somehow offer her a shred of grace in the face of her impending imprisonment. I stood immaculately at the edge of the stage, my emerald green suit pristine, my posture radiating absolute untouchable power. I looked down at the sobbing, broken woman kneeling in the wreckage of her stolen life. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel anger or sadness or even vindication. I felt nothing but a cold, clinical detachment. I stared directly into her desperate, tear-filled eyes, refusing to offer her a single word of comfort or a single promise of mercy. I did not owe this criminal a single syllable of reassurance regarding the fate of my biological daughter. I turned my back on her completely. I stepped down from the opposite side of the stage, my heels clicking sharply against the polished wood. I walked smoothly and confidently through the center of the grand ballroom. The crowd of stunned, silent elites parted instantly, creating a wide, clear path for me to the heavy mahogany exit doors. I did not look back at Damian pinned against the ruined catering table. I did not look back at Beatrice being restrained by federal officers, and I did not look back at Monica weeping hysterically on the floor. The structural demolition was entirely complete. I had successfully navigated the most toxic, volatile terrain of my life and emerged entirely victorious. I walked directly out of the country club and stepped into the crisp, refreshing afternoon air, leaving the absolute destruction of my enemies firmly in the hands of the federal agents. The sterile, imposing atmosphere of the federal courthouse stood in stark contrast to the opulent country club where this nightmare had publicly erupted. 8 months had passed since the federal raid. I sat in the front row of the gallery flanked by my brother Miles and my sister-in-law Nia. We were no longer fighting a desperate defensive battle in the shadows. We were here to witness the absolute, inescapable conclusion of a federal criminal trial. The highly publicized case had captivated the local media, but inside the heavy oak doors of the courtroom, there was no sensationalism. There was only the cold, methodical execution of justice. Damian and Monica sat at the defense tables, but the arrogant united front they had paraded around the gender reveal party had completely disintegrated. The intense pressure of facing federal prison had shattered their twisted romance, turning them into vicious, desperate adversaries. They refused to look at each other. They had spent the entire trial actively trying to destroy one another in a pathetic, scrambling attempt to save themselves. The spectacle of their mutual destruction was a profound testament to the fragile, toxic foundation of their relationship. When Monica took the witness stand, any remaining trace of her former high society aspirations vanished. She wept hysterically, attempting to paint herself as a naive, manipulated victim who had fallen prey to a powerful, wealthy predator. She pointed a trembling finger directly at Damian, testifying under oath that he had used his immense financial leverage to coerce her into the medical forgery. She claimed he had threatened to orchestrate her termination from the fertility clinic if she did not comply with his horrific scheme to secure my biological embryos. She begged the jury to understand that she was simply a pawn in a billionaire's ruthless divorce strategy. Damian's reaction to her testimony was explosive. His massive ego simply could not tolerate being outmaneuvered by the woman he had viewed as a disposable tool. Against the frantic, whispered advice of his own highly paid defense attorneys, Damian aggressively demanded to take the stand. The moment he swore his oath, his pristine corporate facade completely cracked. He launched into a furious, unhinged tirade, shifting absolutely all the blame onto Monica. He testified that she was a rogue, calculating nurse who had single-handedly forged my medical consent documents to trap a wealthy hedge fund manager. He claimed he was completely unaware of the stolen embryos until she announced the pregnancy, desperately trying to convince the federal judge that he was the actual victim of medical entrapment. It was a grotesque, pathetic display of cowardice. Their conflicting, desperate lies collapsed instantly under the crushing weight of the evidence Nia had so meticulously prepared. The federal prosecutors played the crystal-clear audio recording we had captured in the clinic archive room. Damian's own voice filled the silent courtroom, arrogantly boasting about the exact timeline of the pregnancy, his explicit financial motives, and his calculated intention to replace me with my own stolen biological child. That single recording, combined with the original wet ink forgery and the undeniable, heavily documented trail of $15,000 routed through offshore shell companies, completely obliterated their respective defenses. The jury did not need to deliberate long. The day of sentencing arrived with a heavy, satisfying finality. The federal judge, a man renowned for his absolute lack of leniency in cases of corporate and medical fraud, delivered a scathing, unprecedented reprimand. He looked down from the towering wooden bench at the two criminals standing before him. He described their actions not simply as financial crimes, but as a profound, unprecedented violation of basic human sanctity and maternal rights. Damian stood rigidly stripped entirely of his custom-tailored suits and expensive accessories. He wore a standard-issue drab institutional uniform. The judge did not hesitate. He sentenced my former husband to a mandatory 7 years in a federal penitentiary for massive wire fraud, criminal identity theft, and severe financial embezzlement. Damian's prestigious, lucrative career was permanently eradicated. He would spend the remainder of his youth locked in a federal cell, completely stripped of the wealth and status he had valued above all else. Monica faced an equally devastating reality. The judge permanently revoked her medical nursing license, ensuring she would never step foot inside a healthcare facility again. For her active direct role in the biological theft and the forgery of federal medical documents, she received a strict, uncompromising prison sentence. The horrifying reality that she would be giving birth to my biological child while in federal custody hung heavily over her as she was handcuffed and led out of the courtroom, her hysterical sobbing echoing down the long stone hallway. The federal convictions provided the exact, indisputable foundation required for the final, most crucial legal battle of my life. Immediately following the criminal sentencing, the family court proceedings convened to finalize the custody arrangements. The family court judge reviewed the extensive federal convictions and the horrifying scope of the psychological abuse Damian had orchestrated. Given the absolute moral depravity demonstrated by his actions, the judge issued a swift landmark ruling that set a new legal precedent. Damian's parental rights were legally, totally, and permanently severed. He was stripped of any legal claim or access to our existing son. More importantly, the judge formally recognized the extraordinary circumstances of the stolen embryos. I was immediately awarded 100% full sole physical and legal custody of both Leo and my unborn biological daughter. The court granted me immediate exclusive medical jurisdiction over the remainder of the pregnancy, legally establishing that the child Monica was carrying belonged entirely and indisputably to me. I sat at the petitioner's table listening to the sharp, definitive strike of the judge's gavel. This time the sound did not signal the end of my life as a mother. It signaled the absolute, undeniable return of my family. The dark, suffocating nightmare Damian had engineered to destroy me had been entirely dismantled by the unforgiving force of the law. I walked out of the courtroom with my head held high, clutching the certified court orders that guaranteed the safety of both my children, finally ready to rebuild our lives from the ashes of his destruction. My name is Melody, and 2 years have passed since the heavy wooden doors of the federal courthouse swung shut on the darkest chapter of my life. I am 32 years old now, and the world I inhabit today is entirely of my own making. The chaotic, barren wasteland Damian attempted to leave me in has been completely eradicated. In its place stands a flourishing, vibrant reality. My landscape architecture firm did not just survive the brutal transition, it expanded exponentially. I recently secured 3 major municipal contracts, designing expansive public parks and ecological reserves that have revitalized the entire city. Transforming neglected, barren urban concrete grids into thriving, breathing ecosystems has become my daily reality. It is a profound, constant reminder that even the most devastated, thoroughly poisoned ground can yield spectacular growth if you possess the sheer will to cultivate it. This afternoon, the golden autumn sunlight filters softly through the canopy of ancient oak trees in the exact botanical sanctuary I designed for the city center. I am sitting on a curved, polished cedar bench, feeling the gentle, crisp breeze brush against my face. A few yards away on the lush, immaculate green lawn, my 8-year-old son Leo is chasing a bright yellow soccer ball. Running clumsily but joyfully right behind him is his biological little sister Lily. She is a beautiful, healthy toddler with a laugh that completely fills the open air. Watching my 2 children play together in the dappled sunlight, completely safe and entirely mine, is a profound, breathtaking miracle. The agonizing medical trauma, the forged documents, and the horrifying theft orchestrated by my ex-husband feel like a distant, fated nightmare. The children are happy, their innocence fiercely protected by a mother who refused to be erased from their lives. Sitting directly beside me on the cedar bench are my brother Miles and my sister-in-law Nia. Nia is leaning back, holding a warm cup of artisan coffee, the brilliant, ruthless federal investigative lawyer, temporarily replaced by a relaxed, fiercely loving aunt. She is wearing a comfortable, oversized knit sweater, her beautiful dark skin glowing perfectly in the afternoon light, looking completely at peace. Miles has his arm wrapped securely around her shoulders, watching the children with a wide, genuine smile. This is my true family. They are not bound to me by the superficial, toxic societal expectations that defined Damian's elite circles. They are bound to me by absolute, unwavering loyalty. When I had absolutely nothing, when I was thrown onto the freezing pavement with a single canvas suitcase, they were the ones who pulled me from the wreckage. Nia did not just hand me the legal weapons to destroy a monster and secure my children. She stood as a fiercely loyal guardian over my sanity when the world felt incredibly dark. She provided the impenetrable emotional fortress I needed to rebuild my shattered soul, proving that the family you choose will always outshine the one forced upon you by circumstance. Later that afternoon, I gathered the children, buckling them safely into the plush leather seats of my brand new, sleek, black luxury SUV. The vehicle is not a product of marital assets or offshore hedge fund accounts. It is entirely paid for by my own thriving architectural firm, a tangible reward for my relentless independent labor. I drive smoothly through the bustling downtown commercial district, the soft jazz playing through the premium sound system, creating a serene atmosphere. We stop at a prolonged red light at a busy intersection near the financial sector. I casually turn my head to look out the tinted driver's side window, and the universe delivers a fleeting, intensely poetic glimpse of absolute, unadulterated karma. Just outside a cheap, dilapidated diner, a woman is aggressively wiping down a sticky patio table with a dirty rag. She is wearing a drab, heavily stained polyester uniform, her posture hunched and defeated. The heavy antique diamonds and custom-tailored emerald silk gowns are entirely gone, replaced by a cheap plastic name tag pinned crookedly to her chest. It is Beatrice, the former undisputed matriarch of the suburban elite, the woman who once weaponized her vast wealth to publicly humiliate me at a Thanksgiving dinner, is now working a menial, exhausting service job just to survive. The massive federal fines, the devastating civil restitution, and the total social exile resulting from her son's highly publicized criminal convictions had completely bankrupted her. Her wealthy country club friends had abandoned her, instantly treating her disgraced family name like a lethal contagion. Beatrice pauses her frantic wiping and looks up toward the intersection, her tired, bitter eyes locked directly onto my luxury vehicle. For a fraction of a second, she recognizes my face behind the glass. I see the profound, agonizing realization crash over her aging features. She is looking at the woman she confidently labeled a barren, defective failure now radiating absolute power wealth and maternal peace. I do not roll down the window. I do not offer a triumphant smirk or a vindictive gesture. I simply look at her with cold, clinical indifference. She is nothing but a ghost to me now, a pathetic, fading remnant of a completely demolished empire that tried and failed to bury me. The traffic light finally turns a brilliant green, and I press the accelerator smoothly. I drive away toward the suburbs without a single backward glance, leaving her to choke on the toxic fumes of her own ruined legacy. As I navigate the highway back to my beautiful, secure home, a deep, resonant clarity settles over my entire being. Damian is rotting away in a federal penitentiary cell, completely stripped of his freedom and his arrogance. Monica lost her medical license, and her liberty paying the ultimate price for her monstrous complicity. But their destruction is not the true source of my victory. The real triumph is the absolute, unshakable power of my own independence. Society often teaches women to endure to swallow our grief and suppress our rage in the name of keeping the peace. We are told to accept the betrayals of powerful men and toxic families as an inevitable tax on our existence. But true justice requires stepping out of the victim narrative and becoming the architect of your own retribution. Modern womanhood is not about surviving a gilded cage. It is about recognizing your inherent unstoppable power, tearing down the rotting structures built to contain you, and designing a reality where you are the absolute, undisputed authority of your own life. I did not just win a courtroom battle. I reclaimed my biological destiny, protected my children, and built an empire from the ashes of their deceit. If you are watching this and currently feeling trapped by people who continuously diminish your worth or exploit your vulnerabilities, know that your current devastation is not your final destination. You possess the internal architecture to dismantle their power and rebuild your life on a foundation of absolute, unapologetic truth. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic environment and build your own success from nothing? Share your journey of resilience in the comments below. Never let anyone convince you that you are broken, because sometimes it is the shattered pieces that create the most spectacular, impenetrable fortresses. The harrowing journey of Melody teaches us a profound and empowering lesson about the true nature of justice and independence. True power does not come from waiting for the people who broke you to realize their mistakes, but from becoming the undisputed architect of your own reality. When faced with unimaginable betrayal from her husband Damian and the horrifying theft of her future, Melody was violently stripped of her finances, her home, and her reputation. Society often conditions women to shrink, to accept defeat gracefully, or to play the victim when malicious people orchestrate their downfall. However, this story completely shatters that toxic expectation. Melody chose to transform her profound grief into cold, tactical precision. Instead of seeking validation from an elite family structure that viewed her merely as a disposable asset, she leaned on the unwavering loyalty of her chosen family, Miles and Nia. They proved that genuine support does not demand performance or perfection. It simply shows up when the world goes entirely dark. The ultimate retribution Melody achieved was not just the federal imprisonment of those who wronged her, but her absolute ability to rebuild a flourishing, beautiful life entirely on her own terms. She took the shattered, barren pieces of her existence and cultivated a thriving empire, demonstrating that absolutely no one can permanently erase your future if you refuse to surrender your inner strength. If you have ever had to walk away from a devastating betrayal to rebuild your own unshakable success from the ground up, please share your journey and comment below.